Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on the distribution tax automation feature in Simple Fund 360. My name is Ryan. I'm part of the training and documentation team here at BGL, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. Now, before we start, I'm going to quickly run through some general housekeeping for the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted on the BGL community, as well as our BGL YouTube channel. Attendees will also be receiving an email after the webinar with a copy of the slides as well as a link to the recording. For the duration of the webinar, all attendees will be on listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, then you can type them to us using that Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Today, I have several colleagues on standby ready to answer those questions as they come through. Now, we've also allocated some time at the end of the webinar for questions. So if you'd rather wait until the end to ask us those questions, then of course, that's fine too. Now, the final piece of housekeeping that I will bring to your attention is the help article that we currently have on the distribution tax automation feature. Now, you're welcome to use this as a point of reference when processing your distributions. The way to access this is from within the software. I'm just using the search bar here at the top of the screen, and I'm going to type in distribution. Now we're going to skip the quick links and we're going to head straight to the help section. And the top option here is the help article. Now, just to show you around, we did have a webinar that we ran when we first released this feature. Now, since then, there have been a considerable amount of updates. So the webinar today will be covering those. And if it goes well, we'll be replacing this webinar here. Now, heading a little bit further down, we have 3 tabs. The first of which is the navigation tab. And this will provide instructions on how to access the feature from within Simple Fund 360. Now, within the screen, there are going to be a lot of buttons. And so when you are processing your distributions and you do encounter a button that you're perhaps not sure of, you can head to the features tab here and find the button and a description of what the button actually does. And finally, the third tab is the supported securities tab. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about system data. So the key takeaway from this is you will be able to find out if your particular holding does have system data by checking the supported securities tab and the relevant financial year. So I will be clarifying a little bit more about system data as we continue with the webinar. Now, the purpose of today's webinar is to look at how to get the most out of the distribution tax automation function in Simple Fund 360 and demonstrate how it can greatly improve the efficiency of processing distributions. Now, we understand that it is the season, so we hope that this serves as a timely reminder to make the most of this function that is both free and currently available to you within the software. Now, for those of you who are either new to Simple Fund 360 or new to the function, the idea behind the distribution tax automation screen is to assist in entering and reconciling your distribution components in Simple Fund 360. So instead of spending those countless hours locating transactions and keying in distribution data from those annual tax statements, what we've done is we've brought it all into one screen. And with the introduction of system data, the distribution components may even be entered for you. So from this screen, you'll also be able to reconcile the distribution information entered both quickly and effectively. Now, before we begin processing distributions, there are a few prerequisites that we recommend taking care of. Firstly, you want the fund to be processed up until the 30th of June. Now, this includes all cash distributions, as well as all corporate actions, and ideally nothing left in those clearing accounts. Finally, you are yet to create entries. Now, the reason for this is because when you do create entries, and when they're processed for the financial year, the annual return is then populated. And so the idea here is that when we enter the tax components for the distributions and then create entries, so the tax components from those distributions can then flow into the annual return. Now, speaking of create entries, If you do have the relevant transactions, you'll actually see a notification within the period compliance screen. So that is compliance and period compliance. So this is essentially where you create entries, notifying you here that the distribution tax components review process has not been completed for the financial year. Now, there's also a quick link to the screen here too. So what we'll do is we'll head into the distribution tax automation screen and we'll have a look around. So the screen can be accessed from within Simple Fund 360 by hovering the cursor over compliance and selecting the top option, which is distribution tax automation. Now, all of your investments that have a unit holding balance, have a partnership distribution, or even a distribution received account will display. Now, with regard to processing the distribution components, you're likely to encounter two scenarios. Either the holding has system data, which you'll see via this lightning bolt here, or it doesn't, in which case you would be entering custom tax data. So once I have shown you around the screen, I'll be demonstrating how to process both of those scenarios. As you'll see here, I've left us an example of custom tax data as well as system data that we can process together in the webinar. Now, having a little bit of a look around, heading right, you'll see an expand drop-down menu. And you'll be able to see all of the transactions that are relevant to the holding that make up the payment received figure. Now, these components, once generated, can be entered and cleared individually. Now, this payment received figure here is the total distribution amount received within the financial year. And the idea here is that we reconcile that with the net cash distribution figure here, which is the sum of all the distribution components that have been entered for the distribution. Now, speaking of these categories, what you do and don't see within this screen can be altered by selecting the Change Visible Columns icon at the top left-hand corner. Now, columns can be added as well as taken away just by ticking and unticking the box. Now, heading a little bit further right, firstly, you'll see an icon, and that'll either be a lightning bolt or a gear icon, depending on whether the holding has system data or doesn't. Now, the idea of this icon is that you would press it when you're ready to start entering the distribution components for that particular holding. Now, heading a little further right, we do have the option to add additional transactions for this particular holding. So once clicking on that, you'll see that they can either be entered as a journal entry or a bank statement. So much like you would see within the transaction list. Heading a little further right, you'll see the option to clear components. So you'll see here that the components have been entered. If I was to click this clear components, they would be gone. So you would need to regenerate those. Of course, depending on whether they're system data or custom tax data would depend on how you move forward there. Now, heading a little further right, we do have a paperclip icon, and this gives us the option to upload documents for this particular holding. Now, a common use for this would probably be your annual tax statements, perhaps for your work papers, and you can just upload the document by either clicking on it or drag and dropping into the box. And finally, you'll see the distribution event history for that particular holding. So in this particular example, you can see that I have generated a few times as well as changed the reviewed and incomplete status. So all the history relevant to that particular holding. Now, it's important to note that at first, all distributions will appear in the incomplete tab. Now, once the components have been generated, they'll automatically transfer over to the reviewed tab. Now, these can be moved back and forth. Now, this will either happen as the system components are generated or manually by clicking the Mark as Reviewed icon here. So while we're up here, I'll show you what the rest of these icons do. So firstly, we do have the option to process distributions in bulk, but you'll see that this is still grayed out. So the reason for that is you can process them in bulk, but you can only do either system data or custom tax data at the same time. So if I was to try and mix both, it would become grayed out again. So if you're wondering why that's grayed out, that's possibly why. So while we're up here, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the rest of the buttons here. So we saw the, sorry, Matthew, we can see your camera. Okay, that's been sorted. So we saw earlier that we can move the distributions back and forth from incomplete to reviewed, and that will be via the mark as reviewed button. We can also clear components in bulk, and that can be done just like you would have seen it in the clear components section here. And that also applies to the distribution event history as well. Now, the final icon is the export to PDF icon, and this generates a distribution reconciliation report. So I'll just quickly show you that. So this is the report generated here. However, we will have a more in-depth look at that once we do have a look at reconciling the components. So it will, within that report, all of your holdings will feature. So it won't matter whether they're in the incomplete or the review tab, whether they're ticked or unticked. So all of those will feature within that report. So now that we're familiar with the distribution tax automation screen and the various functions, we'll cover the two types of scenarios that you're likely to face, being system data and custom tax data. And we'll begin with system data. So to give you an idea of what system data is and how it works in Simple Fund 360, put simply, Simple Fund 360 has the distribution components entered for you. So the way this works is that since the introduction of this feature, we've asked clients to send in copies of their annual tax statements for securities held. And from this information, we've been able to establish the dollars per unit of each component of the holding. So this is then entered into our system by the team, and that dollars per unit value is then multiplied by the amount of units within your holding, which then automatically generates the components. So if you're wondering what I'm talking about, so I'll show you. So say in this particular example, I click on the lightning bolt and we go to generate the components. So we have the dollar per unit value of these components, and all we're doing is we're multiplying it by the unit balance, which will ultimately generate the components for you. So that is how system data works. Now you can participate in this by forwarding annual tax statements to distribution statements at bglcorp.com.au. We just ask that if you do send these through, that any personal information is of course covered and or removed. Now the more of these that are sent in, the better the service will ultimately be. Now I'll demonstrate what it looks like to process system data. I'll begin by finding a security with a lightning bolt. So we can find TCL here, and I'll head all the way over to the right and I will click Generate Tax Data. Now a quick look around this screen. At the top left, you'll see your unit balance as well as a summary of receivables. At the top right, you'll see a list of all the relevant transactions, both distributions and accruals. Now with system data, the idea here is that you reconcile these components with your annual tax statement. So matching them, of course, to the relevant headings. Now, if there is a variance, as well as any additional purchases and disposals, then you will be notified. Now, what you would do is, should everything reconcile, is you would click Generate and mark as reviewed. Now you'll see that this has now been moved to the Review tab, as well as the tax components for the holding have been generated. So in the instance that you need to clear these components, we saw earlier that you did have the option, once they were in the Complete tab, to clear components. Now I'll show you the other way, just so I can demonstrate what this looks like within the transaction list. So we have our holding, TCL, and we want to clear the components. So what I'll do is I'll head to Accounting and Transaction List, narrow the search down to TCL, And you'll see here that the tax components have been entered in the form of a transaction. So in this particular example, they've been posted to the 238 account. And so if I was to say expand on this particular transaction and scroll down, you'll see that all the components have actually been entered for that particular holding. Now, in the instance that I wanted to get rid of this, all I would need to do is tick the box and delete it. Head back to my distribution tax automation screen, refresh the page, head to the review tab, and you'll see that the components are no longer there. So what I would do in this instance is I would tick the box, select mark as incomplete, and we are back to where we started. Now, the other example we'll look at once we've processed system data is custom tax data. Now, in the absence of a lightning bolt here, you'll see a little gear icon. And so all this means is that there is no system data currently available for this security. So that being said, by entering custom tax data for this security, that then creates system data for this holding throughout all the funds on your license. For example, we can see that this particular fund holds NST. Now, if I enter the custom tax data here, that per unit data will be saved for the remainder of your funds that hold this security throughout your license. So to begin processing, I would click the gear icon here where it says custom tax data. Now, in this particular scenario, the way to process this distribution is rather than reconciling against the annual tax statement, you'll see here that there's no information entered. So what you would do is you would copy the data from the annual tax statement into the relevant into the relevant fields in Simple Fund 360. So what I'll do is I'll pretend that for the sake of purpose of this example, I'll pretend that I have a annual statement and it looks like that. Now, going through the headings, what you'll see in the capital gains section is a discount field. Now, this will appear as either 50% or 1/3. And so the idea here is that you just copy whichever appears in your annual tax statement and proceed to do that through the remainder of the headings. Now, scrolling a little bit further down, you do have the option to add a description as well as attach any relevant documentation before selecting generate and mark as review. Now, once that data has been generated, that journal entry that we saw a moment ago has been created, which of course enters all the components. Now let's take a look at reconciliation. So with reconciliation, as previously mentioned, you would begin by reconciling the payment received column against the net cash distribution field. Now, for a more in-depth reconciliation, you do have the option, as we saw earlier, of preparing a dividend reconciliation report from within the screen. So just a few things to point out within this screen. Firstly, you're going to have all your holdings down the left-hand side. Now, under the distributed capital gains column, you'll see a rate column, and within that, you'll either see an S or an I. So what I'll do is I'll get an example open just so when I explain this, you can see what I'm talking about. So essentially all this means is when you see an S, the 1/3 method has been selected, whereas when you see an I, that indicates that the 50% method has been selected. So you'll see either the S or the I here. And so much like the distribution tax automation screen, you'll be reconciling that payment received column against the sum of the various components, which you'll see totaled as a net cash distribution here along the bottom. Alternatively, if there is a variance, you will be notified of that too. Now, if we scroll down a little bit further to the last page, you'll see a totals row, a table for distributed capital gains and gross trust gross trust distributions, excuse me, which is label 11 of the tax return, which of course can be reconciled. Now, a common use for this final page is to reconcile against your annual return. Now, of course, the annual return wouldn't be pre-filled until you've created entries. So what you would do is once you had created entries, you would come back to this screen in order to reconcile against the tax return. Now, you do have these little asterisks here, which will in turn guide you as to what should be reconciled against where in the tax return. So that is also another use for reconciliation for that particular report. Now, once everything has been reconciled, originally being the payment received and the net cash distribution, you would then, in the natural order of things, proceed to create entries, which is compliance and period compliance, and of course, create entries for the period. Now, upon doing that, the distribution components would then flow into the tax return, having been entered from the distribution tax automation screen. So that does conclude the demonstration of the distribution tax automation function in Simple Fund 360.